The frost bit through Sophia Hayward's threadbare shawl as she sat on the splintered steps of the San Felipe trading post, her fingers trembling around $7 silver and a handful of copper pennies, the last remnants of a life that had promised her everything and delivered nothing but ash. Winter solstice, December 21st, 1877. The shortest day of the year, and for Sophia, it felt like the longest she had ever endured. Around her, the Texas settlement stirred with preparations for the evening's festivities. Families hurried past with bundles of cedar boughs and strings of dried chilies, their laughter cutting through the cold air like knives. The smell of mesquite smoke and roasting venison drifted from the adobe houses lining the dusty plaza, and somewhere a guitar played a melody that reminded her of warmth, of home, of everything she no longer had. Sophia pulled the shawl tighter, though it did little good. The fabric was cotton calico, meant for the mild winters of Charleston, not the brutal cold that swept across the Texas plains. Her dress, once of fine burgundy taffeta with ivory lace at the collar, hung loose on a frame that had shed 20 pounds in 4 months. She could see her own wrists now, thin and pale, protruding from sleeves that no longer fit. The bones of her hands stood out sharp as she counted the coins again, spreading them across her lap with the desperate hope that mathematics might somehow bend in her favor. $7.38. She had counted 5 times already. The sum remained unchanged, indifferent to her need. It was not enough for passage back to South Carolina. Not enough for a month's lodging at even the cheapest boarding house. Not enough for anything except perhaps one more week of survival. If she was careful, if she was lucky, if luck was something that still existed in her world. 4 months ago, Sophia had stepped off the stagecoach in San Felipe with a steamer trunk and a future mapped out in elegant handwriting. Daniel Garrett had courted her in Charleston with all the refinement of a Southern gentleman. He had spoken of his holdings in Texas, of the ranch he was building, of the cattle empire he would create. He had shown her daguerreotypes of sprawling land under endless sky. He had written letters filled with poetry and promise, had asked her father for her hand, had sent money for her passage west. The trunk still sat in the narrow room she rented above the cantina, a room that smelled of tequila and tobacco smoke, a room she could no longer afford past the week's end. Senora Vasquez had made that clear 2 days ago, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed over her ample bosom, her dark eyes hard with the practicality of a woman who could not afford sentiment. This is a business, Senorita Hayward, not a charity. You pay, or you leave, Senorita, not Senora. The town had made certain Sophia understood that distinction from the moment she arrived. Daniel had been waiting at the depot, but he had not been alone. The woman beside him was younger than Sophia, prettier, and very obviously with child. When Daniel introduced her without apology, without explanation, as Miss Rosalie Kemper, his intended bride, Sophia had felt the ground shift beneath her feet like quicksand. He had looked uncomfortable but not remorseful. Plans changed, he said, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of her entire life. Rosalie here, she's local. Her father owns the bank. It makes more sense, business-wise, you understand. But he had still taken her money, still accepted the $800 she had sent ahead for her share of the ranch expenses, money that represented everything her grandmother had left her, every piece of jewelry sold, every possession of value converted to cash for a future that existed only in lies. Sophia had tried to recover the money, had gone to the town marshal, a thick-necked man named Pruitt, who looked at her with the particular blend of suspicion and disdain, reserved for unmarried women traveling alone. Did you have a contract, Miss Hayward? Something in writing? She had not. Only letters and letters, as Marshal Pruitt informed her with barely concealed contempt, were not legal documents. A woman's word against a man's held little weight in San Felipe, especially when that man's future father-in-law owned the bank. And half the businesses in town, she had tried to find work. But San Felipe was small, and Daniel Garrett's version of events had spread faster than truth. The town believed she had come west chasing a man who had never promised her anything, a desperate spinster throwing herself at a respectable rancher. The decent families would not hire her. The indecent establishments offered employment she would rather starve than accept. So here she sat on the winter solstice, the year dying around her, counting coins that could not save her. The cold had worked its way through her inadequate shawl and into her bones. Her hands had gone numb an hour ago, but she kept counting anyway, the ritual of it the only thing keeping her tethered to purpose. Around her the celebration continued. Children chased each other through the plaza, shrieking with laughter. A group of vaqueros passed by on horseback, their silver spurs jingling, their voices raised in song. Sophia turned her face away, not wanting to meet their eyes, not wanting to see the mixture of pity and judgment that had become familiar over these months. She was the cautionary tale mothers whispered to their daughters, the foolish woman who came west for love and found only ruin. She should move, should find somewhere warmer, though there was nowhere that would welcome her without the price of a meal she could not afford. One of the coins slipped from her cold fingers and rolled across the weathered wood of the steps, dropping with a soft clink onto the hard-packed dirt below. A silver dollar. Sophia stared at it lying there in the dust, catching the weak winter sunlight. She should retrieve it. $7 would become 6. 6 would not last as long as 7. But a heaviness had settled over her that went deeper than cold, deeper than hunger. She simply sat, looking at that silver coin as if it represented every loss she had accumulated, every small defeat that had brought her to this moment of complete collapse. You dropped something. The voice came from beside her, low and quiet. Speaking English with an accent that shaped the words differently, gave them a rhythm she did not recognize. Sophia turned to find a man standing at the base of the steps, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a mix of buckskin and cotton that marked him as neither fully of the settlement nor fully of the wild places beyond it. His hair was black and long, pulled back from a face marked by high cheekbones and dark eyes that watched her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow was not. He bent down, his movement economical and deliberate, and retrieved the silver dollar from the dirt. When he straightened, he held it out to her in a scarred hand. Sophia hesitated. There was something in the gesture that felt weighted with meaning, as if this stranger understood exactly what that single coin represented. She reached out with fingers clumsy from cold and took it, the metal warm from his palm. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rough from disuse. She had spoken to no one in days. He nodded once, a slight inclination of his head, but did not move away. For a long moment he simply stood there, and Sophia became acutely aware of how she must appear. A woman alone on the winter solstice, thin and shabby, counting coins on the steps of a trading post. Shame rose in her throat, bitter as bile. "I am not begging," she said, though he had not suggested she was. "I am simply trying to determine my options." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile but an acknowledgement of her pride. "I know what you are doing," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only a quiet observation. "You are counting what you have and measuring it against what you need, and finding the distance between them too great." Sophia felt something crack in her chest. The accuracy of his assessment was unbearable. She looked away, blinking against the sudden heat behind her eyes. He was right, of course. She had been calculating impossible mathematics, trying to find a solution where none existed. $7 could not bridge the gap between where she was and anywhere worth going. The man glanced toward the trading post, then back at her. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made her look up despite herself. "I have need of someone," he said. "Not charity, not pity. Work if you are willing." Sophia's heart stuttered in her chest. She had heard such offers before in San Felipe, propositions made by men who saw her situation as an opportunity for something other than honest employment. Her expression must have revealed her thoughts because he raised one hand, palm out, a gesture of peace. "I need someone to help with the household," he continued. "My sister, she died 3 months past. Left behind children who need tending, a home that requires managing. The work is hard, the place is isolated. I cannot pay much in coin, but there is shelter, food, and enough to save if you are careful." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "It is honest work, nothing more." Sophia searched his face, looking for deception, for hidden intention. She found only patience. He waited, unmoving, while she wrestled with desperation and the last shreds of her dignity. "Where?" she finally asked. "North, along the Brazos River, 2 hours' ride. The nearest settlement is San Felipe, so you would be making this journey back when supplies are needed." "Why me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why offer this to a stranger?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his words fell like stones into still water. "Because I watched you sit here for an hour. Counting coins you already know will not be enough, and I recognize that particular kind of desperation. And because my nephews and niece, they need someone, and you need somewhere to be. Sometimes necessity makes its own logic. What is your name?" she asked. "Puupi," he said. "It means strong one in my language. The whites who trade with me, they call me Paul. You may use whichever suits you. And you are Sophia Hayward, the woman from Charleston who came west for a man who did not deserve her. How do you know my name?" San Felipe is small, and stories travel. He met her gaze evenly. "I know what Daniel Garrett is. I know what he did to you. The town may believe his version, but I do not traffic in the lies of white men who prey on good women." Sophia felt tears threaten again, but pushed them back. "If I accept, when would you want me to start?" Now Puupi said simply, "Gather what belongs to you. We leave before the Solstice celebration begins in earnest. The roads become dangerous after dark with drunk vaqueros, and I would have us away from here." She looked down at the $7.38 in her lap. At the trading post behind her, where she had been sitting for hours, paralyzed by fear and indecision. At the plaza beyond, where families celebrated the turning of the year while she sat alone, counting the cost of her mistakes. What choice did she have? Senora Vasquez would not let her stay past the week. $7 would buy her perhaps 10 days of survival. And then what? She could not go back to Charleston. Could not face her father's "I told you so." Could not endure the whispered pity of neighbors who had warned her against going west with a man she barely knew. "I accept," Sophia said quietly. Puupi nodded as if he had expected this answer. "I will wait here with the horses. Be quick. We have distance to cover before nightfall." Sophia stood on legs that trembled from more than cold and climbed the exterior stairs to her rented room. The space was barely large enough for the narrow bed and her trunk. She packed quickly, folding her few remaining dresses, her undergarments, her mother's Bible. Everything she owned fit into that single trunk with room to spare. When she descended, Puupi was waiting with 2 horses, sturdy paints that stamped their hooves against the cold. He lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing and secured it behind the saddle of the larger horse. Then he looked at her, assessing. "You know how to ride?" Sophia nodded. "I grew up with horses." "Good," he said, and helped her mount. His hands were strong but impersonal, offering assistance without presumption. They rode north out of San Felipe as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the winter sky in shades of copper and gold. Sophia did not look back. There was nothing in that settlement worth remembering except the lessons learned through pain. Behind her, she could hear the celebration beginning in earnest, music and laughter fading as distance grew between her and the place that had brought her so low. The land opened before them, vast and rolling. covered in winter-brown grass that whispered in the wind. They followed the Brazos River north, its waters dark and cold, bordered by cottonwoods stripped bare by the season. They passed no other travelers, saw no other homesteads. Just mile after mile of prairie beneath a sky so wide it made Sophia feel simultaneously small and strangely free. After an hour of silence broken only by the rhythm of hoofbeats, Puhopi finally spoke. "The children," he said, not looking at her. "There are 3. My nephew, Nakoma, he is 8 winters. Strong boy, but angry since his mother died. Then Tab's 6 winters, quiet, watches everything. And Kesa, she is 4, still cries for her mother at night." His jaw tightened. "I do what I can, but I am a hunter, a tracker. I know how to teach boys to ride and shoot and survive. I do not know how to comfort a small girl who wants her mother. What happened to their father?" Sophia asked carefully. "Dead 2 years now, killed by Tejano Rangers during a raid. My sister Nekapi, she was trying to live between worlds. Married a Comanche warrior, but after he died, she brought the children to live near the settlements, thought they might have better chances if they learned white ways." He shook his head. "She got sick last autumn. Fever. The settlement doctor would not come. And by the time I brought her to the people's healer, it was too late. I am sorry," Sophia said quietly. Puhopi glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Yes," he said. "So am I. They are all I have left of her now. I will not fail them as the whites failed her." Sophia heard the steel beneath his words, the promise made to the dead. She understood that kind of vow. Had she not made her own promises in the dark hours of the night? Promises to survive, to endure, to never again be so foolish as to trust a man's pretty words. The sun touched the horizon as they crested a small rise, and Sophia saw her destination for the first time. A sturdy adobe structure built in the Mexican style, with a covered porch and a stone chimney from which smoke rose thin and gray against the darkening sky. Behind it stood a barn and several smaller outbuildings. Corrals held horses, and she could see chickens scratching in a yard. It was simple, isolated, nothing like the grand ranch Daniel Garrett had described in his letters. But it was solid. It was real. It was not built on lies. "This is home," Puhopi said simply. And there was something in his voice, a mixture of pride and sadness that spoke of love for this place and pain at what it now represented. Sophia nodded, unable to find words. Her throat felt tight with emotion she could not name. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that might have been hope, fragile and tentative. Like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil, they dismounted, and Puhopi led her inside. The main room was warm, heated by a fire in the stone hearth. The furniture was simple but well made, a mixture of Mexican and Comanche craftsmanship. Woven blankets and bright geometric patterns hung on the walls. The floor was packed earth covered with hides. It smelled of wood smoke and sage and something cooking in a pot over the fire. 3 children sat at a rough wooden table, their eyes fixed on Sophia with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. The oldest boy, Nakoma, had his uncle's high cheekbones and direct gaze, but his eyes held a hardness that made Sophia's heart ache. Taba, the middle child, watched her with the wariness of a wild thing ready to bolt. And little Casa, her black hair in 2 neat braids, simply stared with huge dark eyes that glistened with unshed tears. "Children," Puhopi said in English, then repeated something in Comanche. "This is Sophia Hayward. She will be staying with us, helping with the household. You will treat her with respect." Nakoma's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Tab nodded slightly. Casa's lower lip trembled, and Sophia watched a single tear track down the child's round cheek. Puhi looked at Sophia, and in his eyes, she saw a plea he would never voice. "Help them," those eyes said. "Help them because I do not know how." Sophia set down her traveling bag and crossed to the table. She knelt beside Casa's chair, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "Hello, little one," she said softly. "I know you miss your mother. I know I am not her. But I am here, and I will do my best to take care of you. Is that acceptable?" Casa stared at her for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, nodded. It was a small thing, that nod, barely a movement. But it felt like a beginning. The first morning came before dawn, announced by the sound of puhupi moving through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone long accustomed to solitude. Sophia woke disoriented in the small room he had given her, a space barely larger than a closet, but clean and private, with a narrow bed and a chest for her belongings. Through the thin wall, she could hear him building up the fire. The scrape of iron on stone, the crackle of kindling catching flame. She dressed quickly in the cold, her fingers clumsy with the buttons of her plainest dress. A faded blue cotton that had seen better days. When she emerged into the main room, Puhupi was already preparing to leave, his rifle slung across his back, a hunting bag over his shoulder. He paused when he saw her, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn shadows. "The children will wake soon," he said. "There is cornmeal in the larder, dried meat, beans. Coffee is in the tin by the stove. I will return before midday with fresh game." He moved toward the door, then stopped, his hand on the frame. "Nakoma will test you. Do not let him see weakness, but do not meet hardness with hardness. He is angry at the world, not at you. Tab will watch everything you do and say nothing. Casa, she needs gentleness, but also certainty. She needs to know you will not disappear." Sophia nodded, her throat tight. "And what do you need?" The question surprised them both. Puhipi turned fully to look at her, and for a moment, something flickered in his dark eyes. Something vulnerable quickly shuddered away. "I need to know they will be safe when I cannot be here," he said quietly. "I need to know I made the right choice bringing you to this place." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silence. Sophia stood alone in the warming room, listening to the fire pop and settle, and felt the weight of what she had undertaken settle over her like a physical thing. 3 children who had lost their mother. A man who carried grief like a second skin. A household balanced on the knife edge between survival and collapse. She had come here out of desperation, seeking only shelter from her own ruin. But standing in this quiet house as dawn broke over the Texas prairie, she understood that desperation had delivered her to something larger than her own needs. The children woke in stages. Tab first, appearing silently in the doorway of the room the boys shared, his dark eyes taking in Sophia's presence at the stove, where she was heating water for coffee. He said nothing, simply watched as she moved about the unfamiliar kitchen, searching cupboards for bowls and spoons, finding cornmeal and the clay pot for cooking mush. She smiled at him, but he did not return it, just continued his silent observation. Nakoma came next, his footsteps deliberate and heavy, a boy trying to fill the space his father had left empty. He was dressed in a mixture of white boy's clothes and traditional dress, cotton pants and a buckskin shirt decorated with simple beadwork. His hair was long like his uncle's, but tangled from sleep. He looked at Sophia with open hostility, his jaw set in a line that reminded her painfully of Puhupi. "Where is my uncle?" he demanded in English that carried only a slight accent. "Hunting," Sophia replied calmly, stirring the cornmeal as it began to thicken. "He will return before midday." Nakoma crossed his arms. "We do not need you here. We were managing fine before. Were you?" Sophia asked mildly, glancing at the pile of unwashed dishes in the corner. The dust thick on the windowsills. The general air of barely contained chaos that spoke of a household held together by determination alone. The boy's eyes flashed. "My mother just died. We are in mourning. We do not have time for white women's concerns about clean dishes." Sophia set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. You are right, she said quietly. Your mother just died, and that is a loss I cannot imagine. But even in mourning, you still need to eat. You still need clean clothes and a warm house. Those are not white concerns or Comanche concerns. They are human needs, and someone has to tend to them. Your uncle chose me for that work. If you have objections, take them to him. Nakoma stared at her, clearly not having expected direct confrontation. Most adults, Sophia suspected, had been treating him with excessive gentleness, tiptoeing around his grief. She understood the impulse, but she also understood that children, even grieving ones, needed boundaries as much as they needed comfort. The boy's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment she thought he might argue further. Instead, he turned and stalked outside, the door slamming behind him. Tab, still standing in the doorway, made a small sound that might have been approval. Sophia looked at him and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile before the child's expression went neutral again. He crossed to the table and sat, watching as she ladled cornmeal mush into bowls. When she set one before him with a spoon, he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt like a small victory. Casa emerged last, her small face puffy from sleep and tears. She wore a simple cotton dress that was too large for her, clearly a hand-me-down, and her feet were bare despite the cold. Sophia's heart clenched at the sight. The child looked lost, adrift in a world that had become incomprehensible. Sophia knelt down, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. "Good morning, little one," she said gently. "Are you hungry?" Casa nodded, her thumb creeping toward her mouth. Sophia stood and prepared a bowl of mush, adding a precious spoonful of honey she had found in the cupboard. She set it on the table and lifted Casa into a chair, then fetched a shawl from her room and wrapped it around the child's thin shoulders. "There," she said. "Better?" Casa looked up at her with those huge dark eyes and whispered something in Comanche that Sophia did not understand. Tob spoke for the first time, his voice soft. "She says you are kind. She says you smell like flowers." Sophia felt her throat tighten. "I will take that as a compliment," she managed. Casa reached out and touched Sophia's hand, a tentative gesture, testing whether this new presence in her world could be trusted. Sophia turned her palm up, letting the child's small fingers rest against hers, and they sat that way for a moment, connected by the simple human need for contact. The morning passed in work. After the children ate, Sophia heated water and washed the accumulated dishes, scrubbing away days' worth of grime. She swept the floors, finding corners thick with dust and debris. She sorted through the larder, taking stock of supplies, noting what was running low. Beans, salt, flour, coffee. She would need to speak with Puhupi about making the trip to San Felipe for provisions, though the thought of returning to that town made her stomach clench. Tave shadowed her throughout the morning, maintaining his watchful silence but staying close, as if trying to determine through observation alone whether she could be trusted. Casa played near the fire with a corn husk doll, singing to herself in Comanche, occasionally looking up to make sure Sophia had not vanished. Nakoma remained outside, and through the window Sophia could see him chopping wood with more force than necessary. Each strike of the axe a declaration of his anger at the world. When Puhupi returned just before noon, he carried 2 rabbits and a string of quail. Sophia met him at the door, taking the game from him without hesitation, despite never having prepared such things in Charleston. He raised an eyebrow at her willingness, but said nothing, simply showed her how to dress the rabbits, his hands quick and sure as he demonstrated the cuts, the careful removal of hide and innards.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
She watched closely, committing the process to memory, understanding that this knowledge was survival here. "You learn fast," he observed, washing his hands in the basin. Sophia shrugged, plucking feathers from one of the quail. "I have no choice but to learn." This is not Charleston. Nothing here is familiar. I either adapt or fail, and I have done enough failing for one lifetime." Puhupi studied her for a moment, and she felt the weight of his assessment. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect? A fine lady unable to stomach the sight of blood? Someone who would weep at the isolation and beg to return to town?" He smiled slightly, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "Yes, something like that." Sophia began preparing the quail for cooking, her movements careful. "I was a fine lady once," she said quietly. "Or I thought I was. Turns out fine ladies are just women who have not yet had their illusions stripped away. I have no illusions left, Puhupi. I know exactly what I am now. A woman with $7 to her name and nowhere else to go. That tends to make one practical. There are worse things to be than practical," Puhupi said. He moved to the fire, adding wood, adjusting the logs. "My sister, Nakapi, she was practical too. Had to be, raising 3 children alone after my brother-in-law died. The Comanche way and the white way, they do not always align. She tried to give her children the best of both worlds, but the whites saw them as savages and the people saw them as too touched by white influence. She existed between, never fully belonging to either. Is that why you live here?" Sophia asked. "Between the settlement and the Comanche lands?" Puhupi nodded. "I scout for the army sometimes, track for ranchers who lose cattle. I trade with both sides. It is a careful balance, being trusted by neither but needed by both." He looked at her directly. "You understand this, I think. Living between worlds. No longer belonging to the place you came from. Not yet accepted in the place you are." Sophia felt the accuracy of his words like a blade. "Yes," she said simply. "I understand." They worked in companionable silence for a time, preparing the meal. Sophia found herself watching how Puhupi moved through the space, the economy of his gestures, the way he anticipated needs before they arose. He was a man accustomed to caring for himself, to managing alone, yet there was a weariness in him that spoke of the cost of such independence. The children ate the midday meal with better grace than breakfast. Even Nakoma came inside, though he sat as far from Sophia as the small table allowed and refused to meet her eyes. Casa climbed into the chair beside Sophia without being asked, a small declaration of allegiance that made the older boy's jaw tighten. Tab watched everything, his expression thoughtful. And when Sophia served him a portion of rabbit stew, he murmured thank you in careful English. After the meal, Puhupi took the boys outside to work with the horses. Through the window, Sophia watched him teaching them to handle the young colts, his patience evident in every movement. Nakoma was skilled, his hands confident on the lead rope, but there was a recklessness in how he approached the animals, a need to prove something. Tav was gentler, more cautious, waiting for the horse to come to him rather than forcing contact. Puhupi worked with both, correcting Nakoma's aggression, encouraging Tobei's patience. Casa stayed inside with Sophia, helping in small ways as the woman tackled the truly neglected corners of the house. The child handed her rags, carried small items, chattering in a mixture of Comanche and English that Sophia could only half understand. But understanding the words mattered less than understanding the need. Casa needed to be useful, needed to feel that she belonged in this new configuration of her broken family. So Sophia gave her tasks, praised her efforts, and felt the small hands slip into hers more frequently as the afternoon wore on. Evening came early in winter. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose. Sophia prepared supper while Puhupi and the boys finished the outside chores, the rhythm of the day establishing itself like a heartbeat. When they gathered at the table again, there was something different in the air, a slight easing of the morning's tension. Tav asked Sophia a question about Charleston, his curiosity overcoming his reserve. She answered honestly, describing the streets and the harbor, the grand houses and the strict society. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Sophia glanced at Puhopi, who was listening while appearing not to, his attention seemingly focused on his food. "Because I believed a lie," she said carefully. "Because someone promised me a future that did not exist, and I was foolish enough to trust him." She met Tabe's eyes. Sometimes people are not what they seem. Sometimes the things that look most beautiful are built on deception, like the whites who promise the people peace and then take their land. Nakoma said, his voice sharp with challenge. Sophia nodded slowly. "Yes, like that. Deception takes many forms, but the betrayal feels the same whether it is land or love or life itself." The boy stared at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, a slight crack in the wall of his anger. He said nothing more, but he did not look away. And Sophia understood that she had passed some kind of test after supper. Puhupi took the boys upstairs to the small loft where they slept, leaving Sophia to settle Casa in the tiny room off the kitchen that had been Nakapi's. The child's belongings were still there, carefully preserved by Puhupi's grief. Sophia found a clean nightdress and helped Casa change, braiding her hair for sleep. Singing a lullaby her own mother had sung to her long ago in a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Casa listened with her eyes growing heavy, her thumb in her mouth, and when Sophia made to leave, the child's hand shot out and grabbed her skirt. "Stay," she whispered in English. "Please stay." Sophia's heart broke and mended simultaneously. She settled onto the edge of the small bed and kept singing, her voice soft in the quiet room until Casa's breathing deepened and her grip on the fabric loosened. Even then, Sophia stayed a while longer, watching the child's peaceful face, understanding that this was her purpose here. Not just cooking and cleaning, but this. Being present. Being steady. Being the thing these children could hold on to when grief threatened to sweep them away. When she finally emerged, she found Puhupi sitting by the fire, a piece of leather in his hands that he was working with careful precision. He looked up as she approached, and his expression held a question. "She is asleep," Sophia said quietly. "She asked me to stay with her." Puhupi nodded, something easing in his shoulders. "She has not asked that of me. I think she knows I do not know how to comfort her the way a woman can." Sophia sat in the chair across from him, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. "You are doing better than you think," she said. "They are fed, clothed, safe. You have given them stability when their world fell apart. That is no small thing." Puhipi's hands stilled on the leather. "But it is not enough. A child needs more than stability. Needs warmth, tenderness, the kind of care my sister gave them that I do not know how to replicate. Then we will figure it out together," Sophia heard herself say. "You teach me what you know about this land, about survival here. I will do what I can for the children's hearts. Between us, perhaps we can give them what they need." Puhi looked at her across the firelight, and in his eyes she saw gratitude mixed with something else, something cautious and fragile. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. When Sophia finally retired to her small room, she lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. The fire crackling. The wind outside. Somewhere above, one of the boys turning in sleep. It was nothing like her room in Charleston with its fine furniture and soft mattress. Nothing like the future she had imagined when she boarded the stage heading west. But as sleep claimed her, Sophia realized something that surprised her. For the first time in months, she was not counting coins or calculating impossible mathematics. For the first time since Daniel Garrett's betrayal, she was not thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking instead about what might be built here in this strange between place. With these wounded children and this grieving man who had offered her burden sharing when she had nothing left to give. 3 weeks passed like water finding its course, carving new channels through stone. Sophia learned the rhythms of the household, the way one learns a language, through immersion and necessity. She discovered that Puhupi rose an hour before dawn to check the horses, that Nakoma had nightmares on nights when the wind howled like wolves, that Tabi hoarded small treasures under his mattress, smooth stones and feathers, and a broken pocket watch that had belonged to his father. She learned that Casa would eat anything with honey but refused beans, that the water from the well tasted of minerals and iron, that the chimney drew poorly when the wind came from the north. The house transformed under her attention. Windows that had been opaque with grime now let in winter sunlight. The floors, scrubbed and swept daily, gleamed dully in the firelight. She had reorganized the larder with ruthless efficiency, grouping like items together, discarding things that had gone rancid or been invaded by mice. The pile of mending that had accumulated over months of Puhipi's solitary management slowly diminished as she worked by lamplight each evening, her needle flashing as she repaired tears and replaced buttons. But it was not the physical transformation that mattered most. It was the small moments that accumulated like snow, each one insignificant alone, but together creating something substantial. It was Nakoma grudgingly admitting that her cornbread was better than his uncle's, his tone still challenging, but his eyes less hostile. It was Tabi bringing her a smooth river stone he had found, placing it carefully on the kitchen sill without explanation, a gift offered in his careful silence. It was Casa's arms around her neck each morning, the child's face pressed against her shoulder as if drawing strength for the day ahead, and it was Puhopi, watching her with those dark, assessing eyes, his expression unreadable, but his actions speaking louder than words. He began leaving fresh water in the basin each morning before she woke, started taking his muddy boots off outside without being reminded. Once, she found wildflowers on the table, winter hardy blooms that must have taken him an hour to find, arranged in a clay jar with unexpected grace. He never mentioned placing them there, and she never asked. But she kept them until the petals dried and fell, then pressed the best ones between the pages of her mother's Bible on a morning sharp with frost. Puhupi announced over breakfast that they needed to make a supply run to San Felipe. The larder was running low on essentials they could not produce themselves: flour, coffee, salt, sugar. Fabric for new clothes, as the children were growing and their current garments were becoming threadbare. Ammunition for hunting. Sophia's stomach clenched at the thought of returning to that town, of facing the people who had watched her fall and done nothing to break her descent. "I can make a list," she said carefully. "You could go alone. It would be faster." Puhipi shook his head. "You know better than I what is needed for the household. What fabrics are suitable, what supplies we lack that I might not notice. And besides," he met her eyes steadily, "you cannot hide from that place forever. If you are to live here, you will need to face the town eventually. Better to do it now, with purpose, than to let fear make the choice for you." She wanted to argue, but knew he was right. San Felipe was the nearest settlement, the only place to purchase supplies. She could not avoid it indefinitely without becoming a prisoner of her own shame. So she nodded, swallowing her apprehension. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow at first light. We will take the wagon. The children will stay here. Nakoma is old enough to manage them for a day." That evening, as Sophia prepared supper, Nakoma approached her with unusual hesitancy. His jaw was set in that familiar stubborn line, but his eyes held something different. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a question he did not know how to ask. She waited, stirring the pot of venison stew, letting him find his words in his own time. "The town," he said finally. "They will say things. About you. About my uncle. About why you are here." Sophia nodded slowly. "Yes, I expect they will. People always find ways to judge situations they do not understand. Does it bother you? What they might say?" The boy was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that betrayed his agitation. My mother used to say that the opinions of small minds are worth less than dust in the wind. That a person's worth is measured by their actions, not by the stories others tell about them. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, Sophia said gently. Nakoma's expression cracked, grief flashing across his features before he controlled it. She was. She never let anyone make her feel small, not the whites who looked down on her for marrying Comanche, not the people who thought she had betrayed the old ways by living near the settlements. She just kept doing what she believed was right and let the talk blow past her. Then perhaps we should honor her memory by doing the same, Sophia suggested. We know the truth of this arrangement. Your uncle offered me honest work when I was desperate, and I accepted it. There is no shame in that, regardless of what small minds might imagine. Let them talk. We will continue doing what we know is right. Nakoma studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. My uncle chose well, he said quietly, and it was the first truly kind thing he had said to her since her arrival. The journey to San Felipe the next morning was tense with anticipation. Sophia wore her best remaining dress, a dark green wool that had survived the months relatively intact, and pinned her hair with care. If she was to face the town, she would do so with dignity, with her head high and her spine straight. Puhifi said nothing about her preparations, but she caught him glancing at her as they loaded the wagon, something approving in his expression. They arrived mid-morning to find the town busy with commerce. Vaqueros moved between the cantinas and the livery. Women in shawls carried baskets to the mercantile. Children ran through the dusty streets, their shouts echoing off the adobe walls. Sophia felt every eye turn toward them as Pohopi guided the wagon down the main thoroughfare. She could feel the weight of their stares, could almost hear the whispers starting like wildfire through dry grass. Puhi pulled the wagon to a stop outside Garrett's mercantile, and Sophia's hands clenched in her lap. Of all the stores in San Felipe, it had to be this one, owned by Daniel's future father-in-law. Puhupi noticed her reaction, and his jaw tightened. We can go elsewhere, he said quietly. Ride to the next settlement. It is farther, but I will not force you to give money to men who wronged you. No, Sophia said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. They have the best prices and the widest selection. I will not let my pride cost us resources we need. She climbed down from the wagon before she could change her mind, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. Puhupi fell into step beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. The mercantile was crowded with Saturday shoppers. Conversation stuttered and died as Sophia entered, all eyes turning to assess this unexpected appearance. She had not been seen in San Felipe since the winter solstice, and her presence now, especially in the company of the Comanche tracker, clearly provided fresh fuel for the town's gossip mill. Sophia kept her expression neutral and her shoulders back, moving toward the counter where Samuel Garrett stood watching her with undisguised curiosity. Miss Hayward, he said, his tone carefully polite but his eyes cold. I had heard you left town. Thought perhaps you had returned to Charleston. I have secured employment, Sophia replied evenly. I am here to purchase supplies. She pulled out the list she had prepared, the paper crisp between her fingers. We will need these items. Mr. Garrett can add them to my account. Samuel's eyebrows rose. You have an account here? No, Puhupi said quietly, stepping forward. But I do. The supplies are for my household. Miss Hayward is my housekeeper. The word housekeeper hung in the air, and Sophia could feel the judgment radiating from every person in that store. A white woman living alone with a Comanche man. The scandal of it rippled through the watching crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Samuel's mouth tightened, but he could not refuse business from a paying customer. He began gathering the items on the list, his movements sharp with disapproval. Sophia moved through the store, selecting fabric for the children's clothes, her fingers assessing quality and durability. She was aware of the women watching her, their fans moving quickly as they whispered behind their hands. She ignored them, focusing on her task with fierce concentration. "Miss Howard." The voice came from behind her, soft and syrupy with false concern. Sophia turned to find Rosalie Kemper, soon to be Rosalie Garrett, standing with two other young women. Rosalie's hand rested on her swollen belly, a visible declaration of her legitimate claim to the future Sophia had been promised. "How unexpected to see you still in San Felipe. I had assumed you would return to your family in shame." The casual cruelty of it took Sophia's breath for a moment. But she had not survived the past months by being weak. She met Rosalie's eyes directly. "I have no reason for shame, Miss Kemper. I was deceived, not improper. There is a difference, though I understand such distinctions may be difficult for some to grasp." Rosalie's face flushed. "Living alone with a savage is hardly proper behavior for a Christian woman. I live in a household caring for 3 orphan children," Sophia corrected, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent store. "I work honestly for fair wages. What I do not do is judge others based on the color of their skin or the language they speak. But then, true Christianity teaches compassion and humility, virtues that seem to be in short supply among San Felipe's so-called respectable families." The watching women gasped at her boldness. Rosalie's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Before she could formulate a response, Puhupi appeared at Sophia's elbow, his arms full of the supplies she had selected. "We have what we need," he said quietly. "The wagon is loaded." Sophia nodded and turned toward the counter where Samuel was tallying their purchases, his expression sour. "That will be $18.40, he announced, clearly hoping the price would be too steep. Puhupi counted out the money without hesitation, his movements deliberate. As Samuel wrapped their purchases, he leaned forward slightly. "You know, people will talk," he said in a low voice meant only for them. "About you living out there. About the impropriety of it. A woman's reputation is a fragile thing, Miss Howard." "Then perhaps men should stop breaking them," Sophia replied coolly. She gathered her parcels and walked toward the door, her head high despite the burning in her cheeks. Puhupi followed, and as they stepped into the sunlight, Sophia heard the explosion of conversation behind them. Voices rising in excited speculation and moral outrage. They loaded the final items into the wagon in silence. Sophia's hands shook as she arranged the packages, the adrenaline of confrontation making her clumsy. Puhupi noticed but said nothing until they were seated and the horses were moving, carrying them away from the judgment-filled streets of San Felipe. Only then did he speak, his voice quiet but firm. "You did well in there. Stood your ground without apologizing for choices you have every right to make." Sophia laughed, but it came out bitter. "Did I have a choice? They have already decided what I am. A fallen woman living in sin with a savage. Nothing I say will change their minds." "Let them think what they want," Puhupi said. "Their thoughts do not feed the children, or keep the house warm, or make the work less necessary. We know the truth. That is enough, is it?" Sophia turned to look at him, seeing his profile sharp against the winter sky. "Does it not bother you? The way they speak about you, the assumptions they make?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his words carried the weight of years. "I stopped letting white opinions define me long ago," he said. "They call me savage, half-breed, scout, tracker, depending on whether they need me or fear me. But I know what I am. I am Comanche. I am a man who honors his word and cares for his family. Their labels cannot touch that truth." Sophia felt something shift in her chest, like ice breaking apart to reveal running water beneath. She had spent so much of her life seeking approval, trying to fit the mold of what a proper lady should be. And where had it gotten her? Betrayed, abandoned, counting pennies on a bench while the respectable people walked past without seeing her suffering. Perhaps Puhipi's way was wiser. Perhaps the only opinion that truly mattered was the one she held of herself. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the wagon wheels creaking, the horses' hooves steady on the frozen road. The prairie stretched around them, vast and empty, beautiful in its stark winter palette of brown and gold and endless sky. After a while, Puhupi spoke again, his tone reflective. My sister used to say that the white world and the Comanche world both had rules about how people should live, who they should be, what they should want. She said the trick was finding the space between those rules, the place where you could breathe and be yourself without asking permission. Is that what you have done here? Sophia asked. Found that space between? He nodded slowly. This ranch, it exists in the margins. Not fully in the settlements, not fully in Comanche territory. I trade with both, belong fully to neither, and that gives me a kind of freedom. The freedom to raise my sister's children as I see fit, teaching them both ways so they can choose their own path. The freedom to offer work to a woman the town has judged without caring what they think of my choice. Sophia absorbed this, understanding for the first time the gift he had truly given her. Not just employment, not just shelter, but permission to exist outside the narrow confines of what society demanded. In his household, she was not the foolish woman who had been deceived. She was simply Sophia, useful and necessary, judged by her actions rather than her past. It was a kind of liberation she had not known she needed until she found it. When they arrived back at the ranch, the children spilled out of the house to greet them, their faces bright with relief at their return. Casa launched herself at Sophia, wrapping small arms around her legs with fierce possessiveness. Tab hung back, but his eyes tracked her movements as she climbed down from the wagon, as if confirming she was truly there. Even Nakoma's expression held something like gladness before he schooled it back to neutral. Did you get the fabric? He asked, affecting disinterest. For the new shirts you promised? Sophia smiled and retrieved the bundle of sturdy cotton she had selected. I did, and thread to match. We can begin cutting now tomorrow if you would like to help. The boy's eyes lit up despite his attempt at nonchalance. My mother taught me to sew, he said. Said a man who could mend his own clothes would never be helpless. She was right about that too, Sophia agreed, that evening, as they sat around the table sharing the meal she had prepared. Sophia felt something she had not experienced in months. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. That still felt too large, too dangerous to claim. But contentment, the quiet satisfaction of being useful, of being needed, of belonging somewhere even if that somewhere existed in the margins of respectable society. She looked around the table at these people who had become her strange, makeshift family. 3 children learning to smile again despite their grief. A man who carried his sister's memory like a sacred trust. And herself, the woman who had arrived with nothing and was slowly discovering that nothing could become something if you worked hard enough and let yourself be changed. Puhipi caught her eye across the table and raised his cup of coffee in a small salute. A gesture of acknowledgement that needed no words. Sophia returned it, feeling the last pieces of her Charleston self fall away like a snake shedding old skin. Whatever she was becoming here in this between place, it was hers to define, hers to build. And no amount of small-town judgment could take that away from her. February arrived with a thaw that turned the prairie into a sea of mud and brought the first hesitant signs of spring. Green shoots pushed through the sodden earth, and the horses grew restless in their corrals, sensing the change in the air. It was during this time of transition, of winter giving way reluctantly to renewal, that the letter arrived. A rider from the settlement brought it on a Tuesday afternoon. A ranch hand passing through on his way to deliver supplies farther north. Puhupi accepted the envelope with a nod of thanks and brought it inside where Sophia was teaching Casa to form letters on a slate. The address was written in an unfamiliar hand, neat and precise. Directed to Miss Sophia Hayward in care of the Brazos River Ranch. Sophia wiped the chalk dust from her fingers and took the envelope, her heart beginning a slow, anxious rhythm. No one from Charleston knew where she was. No one from her old life had any reason to write. She broke the seal with trembling hands while Puhupi moved tactfully toward the door, offering privacy. "Wait," she said, her voice catching. "Please stay," he paused, then settled into the chair by the fire, his presence steady but unobtrusive.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Sophia unfolded the single page and began to read, the words swimming before her eyes as their meaning registered. "Dear Miss Hayward, you do not know me, but I feel compelled to write to you regarding Daniel Garrett. My name is Margaret Ashford, and until 6 months ago, I believed myself to be engaged to marry him." Sophia's breath stopped. She forced herself to continue reading. "Mr. Garrett courted me in Austin with great persistence and charm. He described his ranch, his prospects, his plans for the future. He spoke of needing a wife to help build his empire, and I foolishly believed every word. I sold my late mother's jewelry to contribute to what he called our joint venture, nearly $400. When I arrived in San Felipe last July, I found him already promised to another woman, a Miss Rosalie Kemper. He showed no shame, no remorse, simply stated that circumstances had changed, and I should have confirmed our arrangement in writing." The paper shook in Sophia's hands. Puhi rose from his chair and crossed to her, his expression concerned. "What does it say?" Sophia could not answer immediately. She read on, her vision blurring with tears that were equal parts rage and vindication. "I made inquiries after my humiliation and discovered you had suffered similarly at his hands. A clerk at the land office mentioned that Garrett had been involved with yet another woman before either of us, a widow from Dallas who lost her entire savings to his schemes before dying of influenza last winter. Her family tried to pursue legal action but lacked evidence." Sophia looked up at Puhupi, her voice raw. "There were others. I was not the first. Not even the second. He is a predator who finds women with means and no protection, makes them promises, takes their money, then discards them when someone more advantageous appears." She handed him the letter, watching his face darken as he read. When he finished, his jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "He should be hung," Puhupi said quietly, but his voice carried a cold fury that was more dangerous than shouting. "This is not romance gone wrong. This is theft, fraud, the deliberate destruction of women's lives for profit." The letter concluded with an offer. Miss Ashford had contacted an attorney in Austin who specialized in fraud cases. If Sophia would be willing to provide testimony and documentation, they might build a case strong enough to bring charges. It would require returning to San Felipe, facing Daniel publicly, enduring the scrutiny of a trial. But it might also mean justice, recovery of stolen funds, and preventing him from victimizing anyone else. Sophia set the letter down with hands that would not stop shaking. For months she had carried the weight of shame, believing herself uniquely foolish, a woman too stupid to recognize deception when it courted her with pretty words. But she had not been foolish. She had been targeted, selected for her vulnerability, her assets, her lack of male protection. Daniel Garrett had studied her weaknesses the way a hunter studies prey, and he had struck with calculated precision. "I thought it was me," she whispered, the words breaking free from the place she had kept them locked. "I thought I had failed somehow, been insufficient, not pretty enough or clever enough to hold his interest. I thought if I had been different, better, he would have honored his promises." Puhupi knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Listen to me," he said, his dark eyes fierce with conviction. "The fault was never yours. You were honest, acted in good faith, gave trust that should have been sacred. He's the one who betrayed that trust, who twisted something good into a weapon. The shame belongs to him alone, not to you, not to the other women he destroyed. Sophia felt something crack open inside her chest, like ice that had frozen around her heart suddenly shattering. The tears came then, hot and fierce, tears she had not allowed herself to shed because crying felt like admitting defeat. But these were different. These were tears of rage, of recognition, of a woman beginning to understand that survival was not enough, that she had the right to demand justice for what had been stolen. Puhi said nothing, just held her hands and let her weep, his presence an anchor in the storm of her emotions. Casa appeared in the doorway, her small face creased with concern, but Puhupi shook his head gently and the child retreated, understanding that some moments required privacy. When Sophia's tears finally subsided, leaving her hollow and exhausted, she found herself still holding Puhipi's hands, drawing strength from the calloused warmth of them. "What will you do?" he asked quietly. "Will you join this legal action?" Sophia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I do not know." The thought of facing him, of standing before the town and admitting publicly how I was deceived, it makes me want to run until I reach an ocean and can go no farther. "That is fear talking," Puhupi said. "And fear is reasonable after what you have endured. But I have watched you these past months, watched you stand firm when the town judged you, watched you choose dignity over despair. You are stronger than you believe, am I?" Sophia's voice broke. "Or am I just good at pretending? At going through motions because stopping would mean admitting how broken I really am?" Puhi was quiet for a moment, then released her hands and stood, moving to the window where pale February sunlight streamed through glass she had scrubbed clean. When he spoke, his words came slowly, weighted with old pain. "I told you my wife and son died of scarlet fever," he said. "What I did not tell you is that I could have prevented it. There was a doctor in Denver, a good one, who might have saved them. But I was proud, insisted on trying Comanche remedies first, traditional healing. By the time I admitted they needed white medicine, it was too late. The doctor came, but Matthew was already gone and Sarah was too far gone to save." Sophia's breath caught. "Puhupi, you could not have known. You were trying to honor your ways, your culture. That is not the same as negligence." He turned to face her, and she saw the rawness in his expression, the wound that had never fully healed. "For 3 years I have carried that guilt," he said. "Told myself I was broken, unworthy of happiness or peace. I built this ranch in isolation, convinced myself I deserved to be alone, because I had failed the people I loved most. And then a woman appeared on the winter solstice, broken in her own way, and I recognized myself in her desperation." He crossed back to her, kneeling again so their eyes were level. "You asked me once why I could not walk past you that day. This is why. Because I understood what it meant to carry shame that was not entirely yours to carry. Because I saw a chance to help someone the way I could not help Sarah and Matthew. And because I was tired, Sophia, tired of punishing myself for being human, for making choices with imperfect information, for trusting when I should have questioned." Sophia reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against the weathered skin of his cheek. "We are quite a pair," she said softly. "Two broken people trying to piece each other back together." Puhipi covered her hand with his. "Perhaps that is what healing requires. Not fixing ourselves in isolation, but allowing others to see our wounds and choosing to trust them anyway." The moment stretched between them, charged with something that had been building for weeks, but had not yet been named. Sophia felt it in the way his thumb moved across her knuckles, in the intensity of his gaze, in the sudden awareness of how close they were, how alone. She should pull away, should maintain the careful distance they had established. But she did not want to. For the first time since Daniel Garrett's betrayal, she wanted to move towards something rather than away. Puhupi seemed to sense her thoughts. He released her hand and stood, putting space between them, but his eyes remained on hers. You need to decide about the letter, he said, his voice deliberately practical. Whether to pursue justice or let it go. Either choice is valid, but the decision must be yours, Sophia nodded, grateful for the return to solid ground, even as part of her mourned the loss of that charged moment. I need time to think. To consider what it would cost versus what it might gain. Puhipi moved toward the door, then paused. Whatever you decide, you will not face it alone. If you choose to testify, I will go with you. If you choose to walk away, I will support that too. You have allies now, Sophia, not just employers or charitable strangers, but people who care what happens to you. After he left, Sophia sat alone with the letter, reading it again, memorizing every word. Margaret Ashford had been brave enough to reach out, to seek justice rather than hide in shame. The widow from Dallas had died before she could fight back. How many others might there be? How many women had Daniel Garrett destroyed in his pursuit of wealth and status? That evening, as Sophia prepared supper, Nakoma approached her with unusual directness. I heard crying earlier, he said without preamble. Was it bad news? Sophia considered how much to share, then decided these children had earned honesty. She told them about the letter, about discovering Daniel Garrett's pattern of deception, about the other women who had suffered as she had. The three children listened with solemn attention, even Casa understanding that something significant was unfolding. Will you make him pay? Nakoma asked, his young face hard with righteous anger. Will you fight back? I do not know yet, Sophia admitted. Fighting back means exposing myself to more judgment, more pain. It means reliving the worst moments of my life in front of strangers. That is not an easy thing to choose. Tob spoke up, his quiet voice carrying unusual force. My mother used to say that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She said the people remember warriors not because they were unafraid, but because they faced their fear and did what was necessary anyway. Sophia felt tears prick her eyes again. Your mother was very wise. Casa climbed into Sophia's lap, her small arms wrapping tight. You are brave, she said in her careful English. You came here when you were scared. You stayed when the town was mean. You can be brave again. The simple faith in the child's voice undid something in Sophia's chest. These children had lost so much, had every reason to be bitter and closed. Yet they were offering her their belief, their support, their fierce loyalty that night. After the children were in bed, Sophia found Pohopi on the porch, standing in the cold February darkness, staring out at the prairie that stretched endlessly beneath a sky full of stars. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him, the boards creaking softly under her feet. He acknowledged her presence with a slight nod, but did not speak, simply made room for her at the railing. I have decided, she said after a moment. I will do it. I will testify against Daniel Garrett, will join Margaret Ashford's legal action. Puhupi turned to look at her, his expression serious. It will not be easy. The trial will be public. The defense will try to destroy your credibility. The town will have opinions. I know, Sophia interrupted. But Nakoma asked me if I would make him pay, and I realized that this is not just about me anymore. It is about the widow who died, about Margaret Ashford, about whoever he might target next if he is allowed to continue. I cannot undo what he did to me, but I can perhaps prevent him from doing it to someone else. That has to matter more than my comfort. Puhupi was quiet for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the darkness. You are right, he said, and you will not stand alone. I will be there, every moment of the trial, every day you need support. We all will. You gave us your strength when we needed it most, helped us begin healing when we thought we never would. Now we give that strength back to you. Sophia squeezed his hand, feeling the rough calluses, the scars from years of hard work, the solid reality of him. When did you become so important to me? She asked, the words escaping before she could censor them. When did this household, these children, when did you all become home? Puhipi's thumb moved across her knuckles in that gesture that had become familiar, comforting. Perhaps the same time you became important to us, he said quietly. The same time we stopped being strangers bound by necessity and became something more. Family, perhaps, or the beginning of one family. The word hung between them like a promise, like hope taking tentative form. Sophia had lost the family she came from, had been rejected by the life she tried to build with Daniel. But here, in this between place with these between people, she had found something truer. A family built not on blood or legal bonds, but on choice, on mutual need transformed into mutual care, on the decision to stand together against whatever came. I am afraid, she admitted. Of the trial, of facing him, of failing. Puhipi turned to face her fully, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with unexpected gentleness. Fear is wisdom, he said. It means you understand the stakes. But do not let it become a cage. You have already survived the worst he could do to you. Everything from here is reclamation. They stood together in the cold February night, hands joined, and Sophia felt something shift in her understanding of herself. She was not the broken woman who had sat on those steps counting pennies and contemplating surrender. She was not the foolish girl who had trusted beautiful lies. She was someone new, forged in the fire of loss and tempered by the unexpected grace of second chances. She was Sophia Hayward, and she would fight. The trial began on a Tuesday in late March, when the prairie had turned green and wildflowers dotted the landscape in defiant splashes of color. Sophia rode into San Felipe beside Puhipi, the wagon carrying not just supplies this time, but 3 children who had insisted on coming, who had declared with the fierce loyalty of the young that she would not face this alone. Nakoma sat tall beside his uncle, his jaw set in grim determination. Tav held Casa on his lap, the little girl's hand clutched tight in his. The courthouse was a simple adobe structure that served multiple purposes in the small settlement. Today it was packed with spectators drawn by the scandal of a fraud trial, by the spectacle of white women testifying against one of the town's prominent citizens. Sophia could feel their eyes as she entered, could hear the whispers that followed her like a shadow. There sat the Charleston woman, the one who claimed Daniel Garrett had wronged her. Living with that Comanche now, bold as brass. Shameless, some might say, Margaret Ashford was already seated at the plaintiff's table, a slender woman in her 30s with kind eyes and iron in her spine. She stood when Sophia approached, extending her hand. Miss Hayward, I am grateful you came. I know this cannot be easy. Sophia took her hand, finding strength in the firm grip. We do what must be done, she replied. For ourselves and for those who cannot speak. The attorney Margaret had hired was a sharp-faced man from Austin named Cornelius Webb, who had made his reputation prosecuting land fraud and confidence schemes. He shook Sophia's hand with brisk efficiency. Your testimony will be crucial, Miss Hayward. Garrett's defense will try to paint you as a scorned woman seeking revenge. You must remain calm, speak clearly, and do not let them provoke you into emotional displays. Sophia nodded, though her hands trembled in her lap. Puhipi settled into the gallery directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a steadying hand on her shoulder. The children sat beside him, Nakoma's eyes scanning the crowd with protective vigilance, Tav watching everything with his usual quiet intensity, Casa leaning against Puhipi's side. The sight of them there, her makeshift family arrayed in support, gave Sophia courage she did not know she possessed. Daniel Garrett entered with his attorney, a portly man named Harrison Blake who owned property throughout the county and had connections to the territorial governor. Daniel looked prosperous in a new suit, his hair pomaded, his boots polished to a high shine. He did not look at Sophia, did not acknowledge her presence, and somehow that dismissal hurt worse than any insult could have. even now facing charges of fraud. He could not grant her the dignity of recognition. The judge, a weathered man named Thornton who had presided over San Felipe's legal matters for 20 years, called the court to order. The charges were read. Daniel Garrett stood accused of obtaining money under false pretenses from 3 women, Margaret Ashford, Sophia Hayward, and the estate of Catherine Walsh, deceased. The prosecution would demonstrate a pattern of deception, targeting vulnerable women, extracting their assets through promises of marriage, then abandoning them when more advantageous opportunities arose. Attorney Webb called Margaret Ashford first. She took the stand with remarkable composure, her voice steady as she described meeting Daniel at a church social in Austin, his courtship, his letters describing the ranch and cattle operation he was building. She detailed the $400 she had given him, money from her mother's jewelry that represented her entire inheritance. When she arrived in San Felipe, expecting to finalize their engagement, she found him already promised to Rosalie Kemper. He told me circumstances had changed, Margaret testified. Said I should have gotten our arrangement in writing if I wanted legal recourse. He showed no remorse, offered no explanation beyond business considerations. Harrison Blake cross-examined her with barely concealed contempt. Is it not true, Miss Ashford, that you pursued Mr. Garrett quite aggressively? That you offered him money without any explicit promise of marriage? Margaret's eyes flashed, but her voice remained level. He courted me for 6 months, sent 23 letters describing our future together, introduced me to his business associates as is intended. Those are not the actions of a man with ambiguous intentions. The afternoon brought Sophia to the stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she crossed to the witness chair, but she kept her spine straight, her head high. Attorney Webb guided her through her testimony with gentle precision. She described meeting Daniel in Charleston, his courtship of her father as much as herself, the letters he had sent filled with poetry and plans. She detailed selling her grandmother's silver and her mother's jewelry. The $800 she had forwarded for her share of the ranch expenses when I arrived in San Felipe last August. Sophia said, her voice catching only slightly. He was waiting at the depot with Miss Kemper. He introduced her as his intended bride and suggested I had misunderstood our arrangement. When I asked about the money I had sent, he claimed it had been a gift, not an investment. That I had no legal claim to repayment. Harrison Blake rose for cross-examination, like a predator scenting blood. Miss Hayward, is it not true that you are currently living with a Comanche man in circumstances that many would consider improper? Objection, Webb called sharply. The witness's current living arrangements have no bearing on whether she was defrauded. Judge Thornton considered, then nodded. Sustained. Mr. Blake, confine your questions to the matter at hand. Blake smiled thinly. Very well. Miss Hayward, you claim Mr. Garrett promised marriage. Do you have any written contract to that effect? Any document in which he explicitly stated his intentions? Sophia's hands clenched in her lap. I have his letters. 26 of them. They speak clearly of our future together, but no contract, Blake pressed. No explicit written promise of marriage. Just letters that could be interpreted as friendly correspondence. Is that not correct? The letters describe building a home together, Sophia said, her voice strengthening with anger. They discuss children we would raise, the life we would share. No reasonable person would interpret such correspondence as mere friendship. Yet you never formalized an engagement, Blake continued. Never announced your intentions to your Charleston community. Never set a wedding date. Is it possible, Miss Hayward, that you simply assumed a relationship that Mr. Garrett never intended? That you pursued a man who was being polite but not romantic? Sophia felt rage building in her chest, but remembered Webb's warning about emotional displays. She took a breath, forcing calm into her voice. Mr. Garrett asked my father for permission to court me. He sent money for my passage west. He wrote of the home he was preparing for us. These are not the actions of a man being merely polite. They are the actions of a man engaged in deliberate deception, or the actions of a man whose feelings changed, Blake suggested smoothly. Surely you understand that affections can evolve, that what seems promising at one time may not bear fruit. Is it not possible you are simply a woman scorned, seeking financial compensation for a broken heart? Sophia met his eyes directly. If that were true, Mr. Blake, I would be the only woman bringing this complaint. But I am not. Margaret Ashford suffered identically. Catherine Walsh died before she could seek justice. This is not about broken hearts. This is about systematic fraud. Blake tried several more angles of attack, suggesting Sophia had been desperate to escape Charleston, that she had thrown herself at Daniel, that she bore responsibility for not demanding written contracts. But Sophia held firm, her answers clear and consistent, her composure unshaken despite the lawyer's attempts to rattle her. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt hollowed out but victorious in a small, essential way. She had spoken her truth publicly, had refused to accept blame for another's deception. The prosecution's final witness was a clerk from the land office, a meticulous man who had reviewed property records and financial transactions. He testified that Daniel Garrett had received substantial sums from 3 different women over 18 months, none of which appeared in the ranch's official financial records. The money had simply vanished into personal accounts, used for purposes unrelated to the cattle operation Garrett claimed to be building. Furthermore, the ranch itself was mortgaged beyond its value, a house of cards that would collapse without continuous infusions of outside capital. Daniel's defense was predictable. He claimed the money had been gifts freely given by women hoping to secure his affections. He painted himself as a victim of feminine manipulation, of women who tried to buy their way into marriage with a successful rancher. He admitted that perhaps he had been unclear about his intentions, that in hindsight he should have been more explicit about his lack of romantic commitment. But fraud? He looked directly at the jury with wounded innocence. I am guilty of nothing more than poor communication, and perhaps too kind a heart. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Sophia waited in a small room adjacent to the courthouse, Puhopi beside her, the children playing quietly in the corner. Margaret Ashford sat across from them, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant. What will you do if we lose? She asked quietly. If they decide we are simply foolish women who should have known better? Sophia considered the question. I will survive, she said finally. I will return to the ranch and continue building the life I have started there. The outcome of this trial does not define my worth or determine my future. It would be justice if we win, but my life no longer depends on justice from men like Daniel Garrett or judges like Thornton. I have found something more important. What is that? Margaret asked. Sophia glanced at Puhopi, at the children, at the family she had built from the ashes of her ruin. I have found people who value me for what I am, not what I can provide them. I have found work that matters and a home that is real, not built on promises that evaporate when examined. Whatever the jury decides, they cannot take that from me. The bailiff came to announce the verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, spectators eager to witness the conclusion of San Felipe's most scandalous trial. Sophia took her seat beside Margaret, Puhi directly behind her again, his presence an anchor in the storm of her anxiety. Judge Thornton called for order and asked the jury foreman to stand. On the charge of obtaining money under false pretenses from Margaret Ashford, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obtaining money under false pretenses from Sophia Hayward, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obtaining money under false pretenses from the estate of Catherine Walsh, deceased, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Sophia sat frozen, the words washing over her like rain after drought. Guilty. The jury had believed them. had looked past Daniel's charm and respectability to see the predator beneath. She felt Margaret's hand grip hers, felt tears streaming down her face, heard Casa's delighted squeal from the gallery. Judge Thornton pounded his gavel for order. Daniel Garrett stood pale and shocked as Thornton pronounced sentence. Restitution of all funds obtained fraudulently, plus damages. 18 months in the territorial prison. A public record of fraud that would follow him for the rest of his days. It was not enough to undo the harm he had caused, could not restore Catherine Walsh to life or erase the months of suffering Sophia and Margaret had endured. But it was something. It was justice, imperfect but real. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some faces showed satisfaction at seeing a fraud exposed. Others showed disappointment that one of their own had been brought low by outsider women. Sophia ignored them all, turning instead to Puhupi and the children who had supported her through this ordeal. Nakoma stood tall with fierce pride in his eyes. Taba smiled his rare, precious smile. Casa launched herself into Sophia's arms with such force they both nearly fell. "You won," the little girl crowed. "You made the bad man pay." Sophia held her close, breathing in the smell of sunshine and childhood innocence. "We won," she corrected gently. "All of us together." Margaret Ashford approached, her own tears flowing freely now that the trial was over. "Thank you," she said, "for your courage. For joining me when you could have chosen silence. Thank you for reaching out," Sophia replied. "For refusing to let him continue destroying lives. What will you do now?" Margaret smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Sophia had seen from her. "I have family in Austin. A sister who has offered me a place while I rebuild. The restitution will help, but more than that, I have my dignity back. I refuse to be silenced. And that matters more than money ever could," they embraced. Two women bound by shared suffering and shared victory. Then Margaret departed for the boarding house where she was staying. Sophia turned to find Puhupi watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What?" she asked. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Because you are remarkable," he said simply. "I knew it when I saw you on those steps, but watching you in that courtroom, facing down men who wanted to silence you, speaking truth despite fear, I am humbled by your strength." Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was terrified every moment. My hands would not stop shaking." "That is what makes it courage," Puhupi said. "Being terrified and doing it anyway." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Come, let us go home." Home. The word settled over Sophia like a blessing. Not Charleston, not the fantasy ranch Daniel had promised, but the real, solid place she had helped build over the past months. The adobe house beside the Brazos River, the children who had become hers in all the ways that mattered. The man who had offered to share her burdens and had kept that promise faithfully. They loaded into the wagon and began the journey north as the sun slanted toward evening, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The weeks that followed brought changes subtle and profound. The restitution from Daniel arrived in the form of a bank draft, more money than Sophia had held since leaving Charleston. She could leave now if she wanted. Could buy passage to San Francisco or back to Virginia. Could start over somewhere new with actual resources instead of just desperate hope. Puhupi said as much one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "You have options now," he said carefully. "You are not trapped here by necessity. If you wish to go, to build a different life, I will understand." Sophia turned to look at him, this man who had saved her in more ways than he knew. "And if I wish to stay?" "What then?" His breath caught. "Then we discuss what staying means. Whether you remain as housekeeper or whether we build something more permanent. Something bound by choice rather than desperation. I choose to stay," Sophia said, her voice steady with certainty. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be." With you, with the children, building something real together. Puhipi's hand found hers in the darkness. I cannot offer you the wealth Daniel promised. This ranch will never be an empire. My blood marks me as other in the white world, and that will always bring difficulties. I do not want an empire, Sophia interrupted. I want honesty. I want partnership. I want a man who sees me as I truly am and values that truth. You have given me all those things and asked nothing in return except my best effort. That is worth more than all of Daniel's empty promises. Puhipi was quiet for a long moment, then stood and pulled her to her feet. There is something I need to show you. He led her to the barn, lit a lantern, and gestured to the far corner where lumber was stacked with careful precision. I have been building, he said, adding a room to the house. A proper room with windows and space for the things you brought from Charleston that remain in your trunk. A room for a woman who's not just hired help but family. Sophia felt tears prick her eyes. When did you start this? Weeks ago, he admitted. Before the trial, before we knew how it would end. Because regardless of the verdict, I wanted you to know you had a place here that was truly yours. That you were not temporary or conditional, but essential. She kissed him then, standing in the lamplight among the sawdust and horses, and it was nothing like the calculated romance Daniel had performed. It was real and awkward and perfect, a promise made without pretty words, but with solid intention. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Puhipi rested his forehead against hers. I did not think I would ever want this again, he said quietly. Did not think I deserved to build a future after failing Sarah and Matthew. But you have shown me that surviving is not the same as being dead, that there is no honor in punishing yourself forever for being human. We heal each other, Sophia whispered. We share the burdens until they become light enough to carry. They stood together in the warm barn, holding each other as the horses shifted in their stalls and the night wind moved through the rafters. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly beneath stars that had witnessed countless stories of loss and redemption. Of endings that became beginnings if you were brave enough to let them. 3 months later, on a June morning when wildflowers covered the prairie in waves of color, Sophia Hayward became Sophia, standing not in a grand church, but in the simple adobe house beside the Brazos River, with 3 children as witnesses and a circuit preacher who asked no questions about propriety or convention. She wore a new dress made from fabric purchased with restitution money, pale blue cotton that moved like water, and she carried wildflowers the children had gathered at dawn. Puhipi stood before her in a mixture of white and Comanche dress, his hair braided with leather and beads, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The vows they spoke were simple, promises to stand together through whatever came, to build a life based on honesty and shared labor, to create a home where children could grow and wounded hearts could heal. When the preacher pronounced them joined, Nakoma whooped with delight. Tob smiled his rare smile. Casa threw flower petals with abandon that evening. As celebration turned to quiet and the children finally slept, Sophia stood on the porch of what was now truly her home and looked out at the land she had come to love. The prairie stretched endless and free, a place between worlds where anything was possible if you were brave enough to claim it. She thought about the woman she had been on the winter solstice, hollow and desperate. Counting pennies with hands gone numb from cold and hopelessness, Puhipi came to stand beside her, his arms slipping around her waist with the easy comfort of belonging. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Sophia leaned into his warmth. "I am thinking about how far I have traveled to arrive exactly where I needed to be. How the worst day of my life led me to the best. How losing everything taught me what was actually worth having, and what is that? Home," she said simply. "Not a place but a choice. The decision to build something real with people who value truth over comfort, who share burdens instead of keeping score, who understand that healing is not a destination, but a daily practice of showing up for each other. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere on the prairie, a coyote called to its pack. In the house behind them, 3 children slept secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. And on the porch of that simple adobe structure, 2 people who had learned to survive alone discovered that surviving together was infinitely better. Sophia had given up on the winter solstice, had believed herself beyond saving, beyond hope, beyond any future worth claiming. But a Comanche man had knelt beside her and whispered that he would share her burden, and in that sharing had shown her a truth she had forgotten: that no one is beyond redemption, that second chances come to those brave enough to accept them, that family is built not by blood, but by choice, and love grows strongest in the soil of honest labor and mutual respect. The morning would bring new challenges, new work, the ongoing negotiation of building a life in the spaces between cultures and conventions. But tonight there was only this: the weight of Puhipi's arm around her shoulders, the sound of children breathing in sleep, the prairie wind carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Sophia closed her eyes and let herself feel it all: the gratitude and hope and fierce determination to protect what they had built together. She had given up once, but she would never give up again. This life, these people, this love, they were worth fighting for, worth choosing every day with the same intention she had chosen that first terrifying step onto Puhipi's wagon. And if the world wanted to judge that choice, let them. She had learned the hard way that the only opinion that mattered was the one she held of herself. And standing here in the warm June darkness with her husband beside her and her children safe within, Sophia knew exactly what she was. She was home. 5 years had rewritten the landscape of Sophia's life in ways she could never have imagined on that frozen December morning when despair had reduced her world to 74 cents and a splintered bench. The ranch beside the Brazos River had grown into a working homestead that fed and sheltered 2 families, employed 3 ranch hands, and had become known throughout the territory as a place where honest dealing mattered more than profit margins. Sophia stood in the doorway of the expanded house, watching the organized chaos of an early autumn morning unfold across the yard. Nakoma, now 13 and tall enough to look his uncle in the eye, worked with the horses in the far corral, his movements confident and skilled. The anger that had once defined him had mellowed into determination, channeled into the work he loved and the responsibility he carried with increasing maturity. Tob emerged from the barn carrying milk pails, his 11-year-old frame still slight, but his quiet competence evident in every deliberate movement. He had discovered a gift for understanding animals that went beyond training into something almost mystical. Casa appeared around the corner of the house, her 9-year-old energy undimmed by the early hour, leading by the hand a small boy who had just turned 2. Daniel named for the Hebrew meaning, "God is my judge," a reminder that ultimate justice belonged to powers beyond human failing. Mama, Casa called, using the title she had claimed for Sophia 3 years ago when the legal adoption had been finalized. "Daniel wants to see the new foals, but Uncle Puhipi said I must ask you first." Sophia smiled at the careful navigation of household authority. "You may take him to the barn, but stay where Tob can see you. He is too small to be near the horses without supervision." Sophia's hand moved unconsciously to her swollen belly, feeling the flutter of movement there. Another child would arrive before winter, a daughter if the midwife's predictions held true. She knew now what to expect, knew she had Puhipi's steady support and the children's excitement to sustain her through the difficult months ahead. Margaret Ashford's letter had arrived last week, forwarded from San Felipe with the monthly supply delivery. She had married a lawyer in Austin, a widower with 2 young daughters, and her letter described a life built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. "We are not perfect," she had written, "but we are honest with each other, and that makes all the difference." Sophia had written back immediately, describing the ranch's expansion, the children's growth, the school she had started in the front room, teaching both her own children and those from neighboring ranches. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road. Puhipi appeared over the rise, returning from checking the fence lines in the northern pasture. At 32, he had grown into his authority, his bearing that of a man confident in his abilities and secure in his place. The community's initial suspicion of their mixed marriage had never entirely disappeared. But respect had gradually replaced hostility as the ranch prospered and their character proved beyond question. He dismounted in the yard and Sophia went to meet him, moving more slowly now that pregnancy had shifted her center of balance. His hands came to her waist automatically, steadying her. "All is well?" he asked. "You rested this afternoon as the midwife instructed?" Sophia laughed. "I am growing a human being, not dying of consumption." "I rested, yes, but I also finished the accounts and started a new batch of soap." "No," Puhupi said, his mouth quirking in that small smile she had learned to treasure. "You are made of something far more durable. Stubbornness, perhaps, or sheer determination to prove that a Charleston lady can thrive in circumstances that would break most people." He caught her hand and brought it to his lips, the gesture still capable of making her breath catch even after 5 years of marriage. "I would never mock you. I am too busy being grateful that you chose to stay that evening." After the children were fed and the younger ones put to bed, the family gathered in the main room as had become their custom. Nakoma read aloud from one of the books Sophia had ordered from a catalog. Tob worked on a bridle he was tooling with intricate geometric patterns. Casa practiced her letters on a slate, forming words with fierce concentration. Puhupi sat beside Sophia on the settee he had built last winter, his arm around her shoulders. "We teach the children both ways," Sophia said firmly, responding to his concerns about the shrinking Comanche territories. "We give them English and Comanche, white learning and traditional knowledge, so they can navigate whatever world they inherit. We cannot stop what is coming, but we can prepare the next generation to survive it with their dignity intact." Later, alone in their bedroom with moonlight streaming through the windows, Puhupi helped her undress with gentle care. His hands moved over her swollen belly with reverence, feeling their daughter move beneath his palm. "She will be strong like her mother," he said softly. "Stubborn and determined and unwilling to accept defeat." Sophia covered his hand with hers. "She will be loved. That is what matters most. Everything else we can teach her." She thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, hollow with despair and certain her life was over at 23. That woman had believed happiness was something granted by others, that her worth depended on a man's validation, that losing everything meant there was nothing left to build with. How wrong she had been. Losing everything had freed her to discover what actually mattered. Worth was not something given or taken away by others. It was intrinsic, earned through honest work and genuine care for the people who depended on you. Happiness was not a destination but a practice, the daily choice to find joy in small things. Love was not the pretty poetry Daniel had written, but the unglamorous reality of Puhupi checking that she had rested, of nursing sick children through long nights, of standing together against a world that often seemed determined to break them. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophia asked into the darkness. "Offering help to a desperate stranger? Taking on the complications I brought with me?" Puhipi was quiet for a moment. "Every day," he said, and her heart stopped until he continued. "I regret that I did not find you sooner, that you had to suffer months alone before our paths crossed. But regret bringing you into our lives. Never. You saved us as much as we saved you." Sophia felt tears slide down her temples into her hair, but they were good tears, the kind that came from being seen and valued exactly as you were. Outside, a coyote called to the moon. These were the sounds of home, of family, of a life built from honest foundations. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The garden needed harvesting before the first frost. The accounts required balancing. Letters needed writing. The children needed teaching. The horses needed training. The endless cycle of ranch work would continue regardless of her swollen ankles or aching back. But she would face it all alongside people who valued her contribution, who shared the burdens until they became manageable, who had chosen her as she had chosen them. 5 years ago on the winter solstice, Sophia Hayward had given up on hope, on future, on the possibility that her life could be anything but a catalog of loss and shame. But a Comanche man had knelt beside her and offered to share her burden, and in that simple act had shown her a truth that transformed everything. No burden was too heavy if carried together. No past too shameful to overcome. No future too damaged to rebuild. She fell asleep in Puhipi's arms, their daughter moving between them, surrounded by the life they had created through determination and mutual respect, and the stubborn refusal to let the world's judgment define their worth. And if sometimes she still thought about that frozen bench and the woman who had sat there counting pennies, it was only to marvel at the distance traveled, at the person she had become, at the fierce gratitude she felt for the unexpected grace of second chances. The winter solstice would come again in a few months, marking 6 years since the day her old life ended and her real life began. This time she would face it not with despair, but with celebration, with children gathered around a warm fire and a husband who knew her completely, with a daughter growing in her belly and a ranch that was truly home. She had given up once, but she would never give up again. And that, she thought as sleep claimed her, made all the difference.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.